On July 28th, 1945, things were pretty reasonable in New York City. In fact, things were probably a lot better than they had been in the last few years. World War II was winding down. In fact, the war in Europe in general was pretty much over. And while the Pacific Theater was still ongoing, it looked pretty clear that the Allies would claim victory and peace could be restored to the world. But what the citizens of New York City didn't know was that in just a few moments, a B-25 Mitchell would get lost in that morning's thick fog and wind up plowing directly in to the Empire State Building. Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains tall. That's all I got, I'm sorry. And today, we're going to discuss a particular disaster that is somewhat lost to history that befell the Empire State Building in 1945. This is the tale of the 1945 Empire State Building B-25 crash. Lieutenant Colonel William Franklin Smith, Jr. was actually a very decorated pilot who had indeed returned from fighting in World War II. He was part of an insane 100 combat missions over France and Germany. 34 of those were as a pilot, and he'd been awarded with 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 4 Air Medals, as well as the French Croix de Guerre. He returned to Watertown, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, to be with his wife, Martha, as well as their newborn infant son. Smith was 27 years old at the time, and he was the deputy commander of the 457th Bombardment Group. And they were in the process of reassembling at Bradley Field, which was the Army Air Base in Sioux Falls, in preparation for retraining in B-29s, as it was possible that they might be redeployed over in the Pacific Theater. Smith had actually been on the final leg of a cross-country trip from South Dakota to the East Coast. And that day, he was in good spirits, as he generally was known to be, but his wife noticed that he was really worried about the weather. That morning, it was gray out and rainy. Fog had rolled in, and Smith was definitely experienced enough to know that that meant there would be poor visibility. But even in those days, that wasn't too big of a risk. Aeronautics technology had progressed quite a bit, and while it isn't as sophisticated as what we have now, it was indeed possible for an experienced pilot to fly with just their instruments, and the weather wasn't such that he would be grounded. He just had to be a bit more attentive than usual. His mission on that morning was actually just a routine one. Certainly a lot better than pretty much any mission he'd ever flown over Europe. For one thing, he wouldn't be getting shot at. He had to fly from Hanscom Army Air Base at New Bedford, Massachusetts to Newark Army Airfield, where he was supposed to pick up the Sioux Falls Air Base's commander, Colonel H.E. Bogner, before he was to return to South Dakota. Because he was in the area, Smith took a short furlough, and that's when he was with his wife and his son. It was such a routine and inconsequential mission that Smith only had one other person on board, 31-year-old Air Force Staff Sergeant Christopher S. Domitrovich, who was from Granite City, Illinois. He had a background of being a flight engineer on board a C-47 for the 72nd Troop Carrier Squadron, delivering paratroopers to Operation Market Garden. He'd actually been shot down over Holland on September 17, 1944, and captured by the Germans, but he was able to escape and make his way back to Allied forces. Domitrovich may not have even been there to be the co-pilot. It's believed he was supposed to be the flight engineer, though sources aren't clear about that. But the point was that the B-25 had a small complement of men on board, but that was okay. The B-25s were medium bombers, they weren't very large, and they were known to be extremely forgiving aircraft, easy to fly, so there were certainly no concerns about such a routine mission. But there was a third person on board. Smith had allowed another serviceman, 20-year-old U.S. Navy aviation machinist mate, Albert G. Perna, who had asked to hitch a ride with them from Boston to the New York area. Perna was on his way home to be with his parents in Brooklyn, and his brother had actually died in May when his destroyer, USS Luce, DD-522, was sunk off the coast of Okinawa. Smith performed his pre-flight checks, warmed up the engines, taxied to the end of the runway, and took off into the clouds at 8:55 a.m. His wife Martha was actually there and watched her husband take off. Less than an hour after he'd left New Bedford, Smith and the two men with him were getting very close to New York City. But the weather was such that, looking out the window, all Smith could actually see was fog everywhere. Just gray, nothing there. He literally could not see at all where he was by sight. He had to rely on his instruments, and he was a little lost. So at 9:50 a.m., he radioed LaGuardia Field to see if they could give him an idea of where exactly he was located. They told him that he was already 15 miles south of the airport, and the two men in the control tower, Victor Barden, the chief operator, as well as Gerald Addy, the supervising air traffic controller, told him to circle back and land there, rather than trying to make Newark. The fog really was that thick. It was very difficult to see, and it would be safer for Smith to wait for the weather to improve before continuing. But the lieutenant colonel was adamant that he was supposed to go to Newark and wasn't willing to land at LaGuardia, even when air traffic control told him that the ceiling at Newark was only 600 feet. Basically, he would be landing at that airfield blind if he went. But Smith didn't believe that that would be a problem, and in his defense, again, he was an experienced pilot, and, I mean, he already had to deal with anti-aircraft fire. It's fog. What's the worst that could possibly... Oh, right, we'll get to that in a second. Victor Barden advised Smith to stay over Queens, on the southeast side of LaGuardia, and south of the nearby Whitestone Bridge, while he contacted Army Advisory Flight Control for authorization to bring the plane into LaGuardia, because they really felt like that was the best idea. But Army Advisory Service said that the Civil Aviation Authority's information that the 600-foot ceiling at Newark was wrong. It was actually 1,000 feet, with a visibility of 2¼ miles. That was reasonable for Smith to handle, and when he was told that, he said that he wanted to proceed to Newark anyway, as Colonel Bogner was indeed waiting for him there, and he didn't want to hold him up. With nothing more they could do, Barden cleared Smith for Newark, but told him that he was unable to see the top of the Empire State Building from his perch in the tower. In other words, visibility was really bad. Smith was operating without any kind of navigator on board his B-25, and at that point, he thought that he was west of Manhattan over the Hudson River. He wasn't. He was over the East River, and was actually on course dead center in the middle of Manhattan. He flew southwest for what he thought was Newark, but he realized his mistake pretty much immediately, as he suddenly found himself surrounded by skyscrapers. That was not supposed to happen at all. Nothing about this was okay. And Smith, though confused and lost, immediately tried to correct the situation as best he could. He came very close to hitting the Art Deco Chrysler building, but did steer around it, as well as the Grand Central office building. He attempted to climb and veer away from the danger, but by this time it was too late. When he realized that the B-25 Mitchell was heading directly at the Empire State Building, there was no amount of maneuvering that could avoid what was about to happen. The plane slammed into the north side of the Empire State, roughly around the 79th floor level, 913 feet above 34th Street, going at roughly 200 miles per hour. That impact tore an 18 by 20 foot hole in the outer wall. The left wing was sheared off and actually sailed down into Madison Avenue, about a block away. Debris from the building rained onto the streets below. Fuel from the plane also burst into flames and engulfed almost the entire floor in fire. At that time, the floor was occupied by the War Relief Services, as well as the National Catholic Welfare Council, and as a result, many civilians were suddenly sitting in a sea of fire if they weren't killed by the initial impact. One man, 37-year-old Paul Deering, was a volunteer public relations worker for the Catholic War Relief Office. He was trapped, and upon seeing the flames rushing toward him, leapt from a window and died when he smashed into a balcony 5 stories below. Another individual, a janitor, was the only person in the unoccupied 78th floor when the plane hit. He was also trapped and killed by the flames. When the impact had happened, one of the engines from the B-25 ripped off the wing mount and sailed across the entire floor, through the walls and partitions, and burst out of the south side of the building. It crashed upon a 12-story building at 10 West 33rd Street, and started another fire that destroyed the penthouse studio of sculptor Henry Herring. The other engine rammed its way through office walls and dropped into one of the 10 elevator shafts. It fell all the way into the basement, 1,000 feet down, taking a fortunately empty elevator car with it. 20-year-old woman Betty Lou Oliver had actually just opened the doors to the elevator that she was operating, and the impact blew her out of the car and into the 80th floor lobby. This badly injured her. 2 women working in an office suite on that floor tried to help her and asked another elevator operator to take her down for emergency medical treatment. But some of you are probably aware there's a reason why in a fire situation they tell you not to use the elevators, and this is a case example of it. When the doors closed, a metallic snap was heard as the cable broke on the elevator, and the car began a rapid descent all the way down. But the Empire State's elevator system actually had emergency hydraulic brakes, and thankfully they actually worked, slowing the car's descent, and the severed cables that coiled beneath the car actually served as kind of a spring that slowed the elevator as it fell. As a result, Betty Lou Oliver wound up surviving this, though she landed hard enough to have further injuries, a broken pelvis, back, and neck, when rescuers found her later amongst the rubble. If it helps, she actually set a current standing world record from doing this, not on purpose, but she did it, because that's the longest survived elevator fall by any person, ever. In fact, there was a second record set that day. Fire stations all over the city rushed to the scene, and managed to drag their hoses up the stairs all the way to where the fire actually was. And the building's standpipes weren't damaged, fortunately, so that meant the firemen had enough water to use against the blaze. Through this incredible amount of effort, the firemen were able to get things under control in 40 minutes. And the Empire State Building fire is the highest structural fire ever to be brought under control by firefighters. Other fires that happen that high are usually allowed to burn because there's very little that can be done, but in this case, they managed to stop it. Also, the B-25's impact, despite being horrible, wasn't actually cataclysmic, at least for the building. The actual load-bearing structures inside the Empire State were okay, so there was no risk of the building actually collapsing. It probably helped that the B-25 was, again, a medium bomber. Not the smallest plane in the world, but definitely not the largest. As a result of this, damage was somewhat limited. In total, 14 people died as a result of this accident, and that included all 3 military personnel that were on board the plane. 24 were injured. Impressively, despite what happened, the Empire State was reopened for business on many floors on the next Monday morning, just 2 days later, mostly because the damage was pretty much contained. They had gotten the fire under control very quickly, and again, the load-bearing structures in the Empire State were not affected by the crash. The building was in no danger of collapsing. And though there was plenty of cleanup work, and it was still a tragedy, it could have been a lot worse. Damage caused by the crash was estimated at about $1 million. That's a little over $16 million in today's money. And the accident spurred the passing of what was known as the Federal Tort Claims Act, FTCA. This act was actually pretty groundbreaking, and it was signed into law by President Truman in August of 1946. The act's main purpose is to actually allow citizens to sue the government, or people acting on behalf of the government, if the government screws up. Prior to that, private citizens weren't permitted to sue the government, even if the government had clearly done something wrong. So this was actually kind of a big step forward in terms of basic rights for citizens. When the floor was cleaned up, the previous occupiers had no desire to return, so Armand Hammer actually purchased the damaged 78th floor. He refurbished it and made it the headquarters of his United Distillers of America. And though the crash was in the news for a time, it was largely forgotten after a while because at the end of the day, it was just an accident. Smith made one mistake in terms of navigation, and it cost him dearly. No one on the ground had really done anything wrong. It was a simple mistake by the pilot, who was inhibited by bad weather. Fortunately, these kind of occurrences are pretty rare, especially in the modern day. Modern airplanes have much better navigational tools than they did back in 1945. And today, the Empire State still stands just where she always was, as an iconic symbol of New York City. And with that, a special thank yous to all my underwater train finders: Sundude267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Josh Johnson, Middle for Life, Guy Anzac, A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Raro Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Lord Hawk 444, Alaric Jaspers, The Baxter, That Guy with a Beard, Mark Holding, Lock Kraken, Murder Drones Doll, A-Person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Ohio Trucker 1, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Icer Fur 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, and Dr. Racer 78. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.